They laughed in his face, every single one of them. And they were dead wrong. When a billionaire heiress tossed a rust-eaten wreck to a broke small-town mechanic, the whole warehouse erupted in laughter. Workers pulled out phones. Someone muttered, "He can't even afford gas money." Serena Langford smiled like she'd done the man a favor. And Grayson Cole, grease under his fingernails, holes in his boots, just stood there, nodding slowly, studying the ruined coupe with eyes that saw something nobody else bothered to look for. That moment cost Serena Langford $9 million worth of humiliation. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. The morning it all started, Grayson Cole was already running late and already losing. He'd been up since 4:30, lying on his back under a 2003 Ford F-15. Oh, that belonged to Dale Pruitt, a cattle rancher from the next county over who had the patience of a lit firecracker. The truck had a transmission problem that Grayson had diagnosed in under 4 minutes. 15 years of working on engines in a dirt-floored garage will sharpen that kind of instinct. But diagnosing wasn't the same as fixing, and fixing required a part he'd had to order from a supplier in San Antonio who took 3 days longer than promised. Dale called at 7 a.m. "I need that truck by Friday, Cole." "I know, Dale. You'll have it Thursday." "You said that last Thursday." Grayson closed his eyes briefly, still on his back, gravel pressing into his shoulder blades. "The part got delayed. It's in. I'm putting it in right now." "See that you do." Dale hung up without another word. That was the kind of morning it was. And it was only 7. The garage sat at the end of a caliche road outside Harlow, Texas. A town of maybe 4,000 people, 2 stoplights, 1 grocery store, and enough pickup trucks to fill a stadium. Grayson had rented the garage space from Old Man Trevino for 6 years, a corrugated metal building that sweated in summer and rattled in winter wind like it was trying to shake itself apart. He'd patched the roof himself twice. The concrete floor had a crack running diagonally from the northwest corner that he'd filled with hydraulic epoxy and mostly forgotten about. There was a coffee maker on a workbench that produced something approximately resembling coffee if you didn't look at it too closely or expect too much from it. It wasn't much. It was his. He had 2 other jobs besides Dale's truck that week. A brake job on a Honda Civic belonging to Marta Delgado, a school teacher who drove 40 miles round trip every day and couldn't afford to have the brakes fail, and a hauling job on Saturday, moving furniture for a couple relocating from Harlow to Abilene. The hauling jobs were newer, something he'd added to the business over the last 2 years when the repair work alone stopped covering everything. He'd borrowed his cousin Ricky's trailer for a flat rate and built up a small, steady stream of weekend jobs that paid cash and didn't require parts suppliers from San Antonio. Between the 3 jobs, if everything went right, he'd clear maybe $1,100 that week. Rent on the garage was $410. Rent on the house was $750. Sophie's school had sent home a form for a fall science camp that cost $240, and he'd been carrying that form in his jacket pocket for 11 days, folded and unfolded so many times the creases had gone soft. He hadn't signed it yet. He kept meaning to figure out the math first. Sophie was 12. She was the kind of kid who found things interesting, genuinely, deeply interested, not in the performed way some children acted for adults, but in the real way. The kind that made her pull books off library shelves about subjects nobody had suggested to her and come home talking about deep-sea bioluminescence or the structural engineering of medieval bridges. She'd gotten her mother's dark eyes and her mother's tendency to get very still and quiet when she was thinking hard about something. She'd gotten Grayson's stubbornness and his unwillingness to pretend things were simpler than they were. Her mother, Carla, had left when Sophie was 3, not in a dramatic way. Not with screaming or a court battle. She'd just gradually become someone who was somewhere else. And then one day she was somewhere else permanently. There were occasional birthday cards and an annual phone call that both of them handled with the careful politeness of people who had once shared something important and now shared only obligation. Grayson had never said a bad word about Carla to Sophie. He didn't see the point. It was just the 2 of them, and had been for so long that the arrangement felt less like a situation and more like a fact, like the crack in the garage floor or the way the coffee maker made its particular gurgling sound at 6 a.m., just part of how things were. Sophie walked the 3 blocks from their house to the garage every afternoon after school and did her homework at the folding table Grayson had set up in the corner near the space heater. She'd eat whatever they had, usually a sandwich, sometimes leftovers from whatever Grayson had cooked the night before. And they'd talk while he worked, her doing algebra or reading, him with his hands in an engine, their voices crossing the garage in the comfortable, unhurried way of people who had long ago run out of things to perform for each other. It wasn't a bad life. Grayson knew that. He knew men who had it worse in ways that were visible and ways that weren't. But there were moments, usually around midnight, when he was doing the week's accounting at the kitchen table, when the numbers refused to cooperate, and he'd sit there in the quiet house listening to Sophie breathe through the thin wall between the kitchen and her bedroom, and he'd feel something heavy and shapeless settle across his shoulders. Not despair exactly, more like the particular weight of knowing you're working as hard as you know how to work, and it still might not be enough. He didn't talk about that. There was nobody to tell, and talking about it wouldn't change the arithmetic. The call came on a Wednesday. It came through a man named Phil Duchamp, who ran a salvage consultation service out of San Marcos and occasionally sent Grayson hauling jobs when the regular guys were booked. Phil was the kind of man who talked fast and meant well and was about 60% reliable, which in Grayson's experience was better than average. "Got something interesting for you," Phil said. "Billionaire woman up in Austin, Serena Langford. You know the name?" "I've heard it." Everyone in Texas had heard the Langford name. Her father, Douglas Langford, had built a fortune across oil, real estate, and aviation logistics before dying 18 months earlier of a heart attack at 67. His death had been front-page news for 2 days. Serena had inherited everything. She's clearing out one of the family warehouses. Big old property outside Bastrop. They got a collection of old vehicles in there, and I mean old. Some of it goes back to the 40s, maybe earlier. She wants somebody to haul the junk out, catalog what's worth keeping, separate the scrap from anything that might have value. You interested? Grayson thought about his schedule. Dale's truck would be done by Thursday. The Honda was already finished, waiting for Marta to pick it up. The Saturday hauling job was locked in. That left Friday open, and the weekend if the Bastrop job ran long. What's the pay structure? Day rate for the haul work, flat consulting fee, if you can identify anything worth flagging to a resale market. She's got an appraiser coming too, some woman from Dallas. You'd be working alongside her. The day rate Phil quoted was fair. Better than fair, actually. Grayson said he'd do it. He didn't tell Sophie that night because he didn't think it was particularly notable. A hauling job. Rich family, cleaning out old property. He'd done 6 or 7 of those over the years. Sometimes you found interesting things. Mostly you found broken furniture and obsolete appliances and the accumulated debris of people who had enough space to keep things they'd stopped needing. He drove to Bastrop Friday morning in his truck. The trailer hitched, leaving before dawn to beat the worst of the August heat. The warehouse was off a county road between Bastrop and Smithville, a long metal building partially obscured by cedar trees, surrounded by a gravel lot where 3 other vehicles were already parked when Grayson arrived at 7:15. One of them was a silver Mercedes. The others were a company van with a logo for a cleaning service and a late-model pickup with a gun rack that probably belonged to somebody on the property staff. A woman was standing near the warehouse entrance, looking at her phone. She was wearing pressed khaki pants and a white linen blouse, her dark hair pulled back, sunglasses perched on top of her head even though the sun wasn't fully up yet. She looked the way people looked when they'd grown up, never having to think about whether their clothes were appropriate for a setting, effortlessly correct in a way that takes a certain kind of background to produce. She glanced up when Grayson's truck crunched to a stop on the gravel. Her expression didn't change much. "Are you from Phil Duchamp's service?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. Grayson Cole." He got out and offered his hand. She shook it. Firm, brief. "Serena Langford." She glanced at his truck, then at the trailer, then back at him with the particular neutral assessment of someone evaluating whether a tool is adequate for a job. "The appraiser's inside already. We've done a preliminary walkthrough. I'll warn you, it's a lot." She wasn't wrong. The warehouse was roughly 12,000 square feet, and it was packed. Not chaotically. Things had been arranged at some point, organized by someone with a system, though the system had been slowly overtaken by time and entropy. Vehicles were parked in rows, some up on blocks, some with hoods propped, some covered with tarps that had themselves gone yellow and brittle. Between and around them, shelving units holding parts and tools, wooden crates of indeterminate age, oil drums, shop equipment from 4 different decades. It smelled like grease and old rubber, and that particular dry dustiness of enclosed spaces that have been mostly closed for a long time. Grayson walked the length of it slowly, not rushing, letting his eyes move across everything without locking in on any one thing too quickly. This was habit. He'd learned early that the first thing that caught your attention in a collection like this was rarely the most important thing. The most important things were usually quiet. The appraiser from Dallas was a compact woman in her 50s named Vivian Hartwell, who wore wire-rimmed glasses and carried a clipboard and moved through the collection with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times and had strong opinions about wasting time. Mostly American domestic, 50s through 80s, she told Grayson when he introduced himself. 2 European cars, one's a wreck, parts only. The other one's over in the far corner, covered. I haven't pulled the tarp yet. Why not? Vivian adjusted her glasses. Frankly, from the rust visible on the uncovered sections, I didn't expect it to be worth the documentation time, but I'll get to it. They worked through the morning. Grayson moved vehicles that could be moved, helped a pair of warehouse staff load obvious scrap onto the trailer, flagged 3 or 4 pieces that he thought had legitimate resale potential. A late 50s Chevy Apache pickup in rough but workable condition, a set of vintage cast-iron shop equipment that would sell to a collector. Vivian had her own list, which largely but not entirely overlapped with his. Serena appeared periodically, checking in, asking questions, making notes. She was businesslike and not unkind, but there was a quality to her attention that reminded Grayson of people who were accustomed to thinking of others primarily in terms of function. Not cruel, just organized in a particular way. At about 11:30, Vivian worked her way to the far corner and pulled the tarp off the covered vehicle. It was a coupe, long and low, European in its proportions. Narrow body, long hood, a roofline that curved down toward a short, truncated tail. The design was from another era entirely, and it was, as Vivian had predicted from the rust visible around its edges, in genuinely terrible condition. The paint, where there was any left, had gone to a uniform dull brown orange. The windshield was cracked in a long diagonal. One rear quarter panel had caved inward from what looked like an old impact. The wheel wells had lacework rust eating through them in overlapping circles. Several of the warehouse workers who'd been hauling scrap drifted over to look. Someone laughed. Not unkindly, just the way people laugh at something that is objectively in bad shape. "That's a candidate for the crusher," one of the workers said. A couple of others agreed. Vivian walked around it twice, crouching at the rear to examine the undercarriage, straightening again. Structurally, it's compromised. The chassis has significant corrosion. I'd estimate value at scrap metal pricing. She made a note on her clipboard. Serena had come to look as well. She stood with her arms loosely crossed, her expression somewhere between amused and mildly disgusted by the state of it. Grayson didn't say anything. He was crouched at the driver's side door, looking at the body line where the door met the sill, at a place where the rust had bubbled and flaked away to reveal the metal beneath. He was looking at the shape of a stamping mark, a manufacturing mark pressed into the body panel during construction. It was badly corroded, but the impression was there. He looked at the hood release. The shape of the latch mechanism was unusual. He straightened up and walked to the front, found that the hood could be lifted manually where the latch had corroded through, and eased it up. The engine was there, heavily corroded, but the configuration was wrong for anything American. Wrong for most European manufacturers he could name off the top of his head, actually. The cylinder arrangement, the positioning of the ancillary components. It had the signature of something built to a specific performance purpose, not general production. "Mr. Cole." He looked up. Serena was watching him. "If you're trying to find a reason to add it to the haul list, I appreciate the effort, but Vivian's already assessed it." "I'm not looking for a reason," Grayson said. "I'm looking at something that I think is unusual." "Unusual enough to haul?" He looked at the engine again, then at the body stamp, then at the roofline. That curve was particular, specific in a way he couldn't name yet, but recognized instinctively as intentional, not a production convenience. "I'd like a few more minutes with it," he said. Serena looked at Vivian, who made a small, carefully non-committal gesture with her clipboard hand. "We've got plenty to do elsewhere," Serena said. "Take your time." She didn't mean it dismissively, he thought, but the tone was the tone of someone granting a favor they found slightly unnecessary. Grayson spent 20 minutes with the car, moving slowly, not touching anything he didn't have reason to touch. He looked at the door hinges, the shape of the window frames, a partial badge location on the front valance where something had been removed. The holes were still there, a particular spacing that he photographed with his phone without knowing exactly why, only knowing that the pattern was specific enough to be meaningful. He found a partial number stamped on a chassis rail that was partially legible through the corrosion, a sequence that didn't match anything he could immediately place. When he came back to where Serena and Vivian were standing near the center aisle, he was quiet for a moment. "I'm not saying this is anything," he said. "I'm genuinely not, but some of what I'm seeing doesn't match up to anything in my experience. I'd like to do some research before this goes to the crusher." Vivian looked at him over her glasses with the particular expression of an expert who has heard this from enthusiastic amateurs many times. "What specifically are you flagging?" He told her. "The stamping mark, the engine configuration, the badge removal points, and their spacing, the chassis number sequence." He showed her the photos on his phone. As he talked, her expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough. A slight tightening around the eyes, a reassessment. "That spacing," she said, looking at the badge hole photo. "Can I see that again?" He handed her the phone. She looked at it for a while. Then she looked at Grayson. Then she looked back at the photo. "That might be nothing," she said finally. "It might be," he agreed. Serena was watching both of them. "What are you two talking about?" "Nothing confirmed," Vivian said quickly. "Mr. Cole has noticed some details that warrant a second look before disposal. That's all." Serena looked from Vivian to Grayson and back. Then she looked toward the back corner where the coupe sat under the permanent low light of the warehouse. "Fine. Don't haul it today." She paused. Then, with a lightness that Grayson would remember later, she added, "Actually, you know what? Do you want it, Mr. Cole? Seriously. You've been good help today, and that thing is going to cost me money to properly dispose of. You want to take it, it's yours." The workers nearby had drifted back within earshot. One of them exchanged a look with another. Someone actually snorted. Grayson looked at Serena. She was smiling slightly, not maliciously, but with the amusement of someone making a joke that cost them nothing because the item in question was worthless. "I'll take it," he said. The snort became a laugh. A couple of workers shook their heads. Vivian looked at her clipboard. Grayson didn't look at any of them. He was already thinking about the stamping mark and the badge spacing and the thing he'd seen in the engine compartment that he needed to find a reference for before the thought dissolved. He loaded the coupe onto the trailer himself, working carefully to position it so the compromised chassis sections were supported. It took longer than anyone thought it would. When he was done, he was sweat-soaked and covered in rust-orange dust, and the workers had gone back to their jobs, and Serena was on her phone near the Mercedes. She glanced over as he climbed into his truck cab. "Good luck with that," she called, pleasantly. "Thank you for it," he said, and he meant it, and she couldn't quite tell why. He drove home in the long August afternoon light, with the coupe on the trailer behind him, and he spent the 3 hours back to Harlow thinking about what he'd seen and what he didn't know and what he needed to find out. Sophie was waiting at the garage when he pulled in. She'd finished her homework and was reading something at the folding table, a library book, spine up, something about the history of cartography, because that was the current thing. She looked up when the trailer came through the door, and her eyes went to the coupe, with the particular alert interest she brought to things that were unfamiliar. "What is that?" she asked. "I don't know yet," Grayson said, which was the honest answer and also the answer that made Sophie put the book down. She walked around the coupe slowly. She was short for 12, dark-haired, serious-eyed, with grease on her left forearm from helping with something earlier in the week that she hadn't entirely washed off. She crouched at the rear where the chassis rail was most visible through the rust, and she looked at it with the same unhurried attention her father had brought to it in the Bastrop warehouse. "It's not American," she said. "No. The body shape is different, like the way it gets narrower at the back. American cars from whenever this is don't do that." "Good eye." She stood up and came to stand next to him, and they both looked at the car together in the long amber light coming through the garage's west-facing door. And for a moment it was quiet, except for the settling sound of the trailer and the distant complaint of a mockingbird somewhere in the cedar trees behind the lot. "Are you going to take it apart?" Sophie asked. "Not yet. First, I need to know what I'm looking at." "Okay." She considered this. "Can I help?" "Yes," he said. "You can help." He made sandwiches for dinner, turkey and Swiss on white bread, the kind of dinner that happened when neither of them felt like cooking, which was roughly half the time. And after dinner, they sat at the kitchen table with Grayson's laptop and began to pull threads. He started with the engine configuration, cross-referencing the photos with databases of European performance manufacturers from the relevant era. The body styling placed it somewhere between the late 40s and mid-50s. That roofline, those proportions, the removal of the chrome work were all consistent with a specific period of European coach-built design. He searched manufacturers, Italian, French, British, German, looking for production runs or known prototypes that matched the proportions. Sophie, at her own end of the table with a borrowed tablet, was running image searches and cross-referencing what she found with the photos Grayson had taken. She was systematic about it, which he'd noticed before and quietly admired. She didn't just scroll randomly, she built a list of what she'd checked and what she hadn't, and she came back to him periodically with questions that were good questions, specific and useful. "Dad, this badge spacing." She held up the tablet. She'd found a reference image, a partial documentation photo from a European automotive archive. "Does that look like your photo?" He looked at the tablet, then at his phone, then at the tablet again. The spacing matched. He felt something shift in his chest. Slow, careful. He was a man who didn't let himself get excited until he understood what he was being excited about. But something shifted. "Where did you find that?" he said. "Motorsport Archive. They have digitized documentation of pre-war and immediate post-war European racing programs. Some of it's in German and French, and I can't read all of it." "What manufacturer?" "The badge is associated with a racing program from a French coach builder. They were active between about 48 and 54. She paused. "Dad, there's a note here about a prototype, a one-off car built for a specific endurance race campaign. It says," she squinted at the translated text. "It says the prototype was never finished for its intended race and was believed to have been exported for private sale in the mid-50s. After that, no confirmed documentation of its whereabouts." Grayson sat back in his chair. The kitchen felt very quiet. "A prototype," he said. "The only one. It says the program was discontinued before a second car was built." She looked at him. "Dad, I know. What do you think?" He thought about the rust in the caved-in quarter panel and the lacework corrosion in the wheel wells and the cracked windshield. He thought about what it would take to confirm this. He thought about the fact that he was a mechanic from Harlow, Texas, with $2,000 in his checking account and an $1,100 week ahead of him, and he was sitting at his kitchen table at 10:30 at night, looking at a photograph of a badge spacing that matched a disappeared French racing prototype. "I think we need to be very careful," he said, "about getting ahead of ourselves." Sophie nodded. She understood. She was 12, but she was his daughter, and she'd grown up understanding that hope and evidence were different things and that confusing them was how you got hurt. So what do? We keep digging, quietly. And when we have enough to bring to someone who actually knows this field, someone with credentials, then we bring it to them and we let them tell us we're wrong. And if they don't tell us we're wrong? He looked at her across the kitchen table in the light of the single overhead fixture, the sandwich plates still between them, the library book about cartography spine up on the counter. "Then we figure out what that means," he said. "Together." Sophie looked at the photos again. Then she looked at her father with the particular steadiness that sometimes caught him off guard, that thing she had of looking at a hard situation and not flinching from it. Okay, she said. I'm going to write down everything we've found so far. She pulled a spiral notebook from her backpack and started writing in her careful, slightly cramped handwriting. And Grayson went back to the laptop, and the mockingbird outside had gone quiet, and the house settled around them the way houses do at night. And outside on the trailer in the dark, the ruined coupe sat in its rust and silence, holding whatever it was holding, waiting to be understood. It had been waiting a long time. It could wait a little longer. The notebook Sophie had started that night became something else entirely over the following weeks. Less a record and more a living document, pages filling with her careful handwriting interspersed with Grayson's looser scrawl in the margins, printouts taped to the inside covers, sticky notes flagging pages that needed follow-up. She divided it into sections without being asked. What they knew, what they suspected, what they needed to verify, and what they still couldn't explain. 12 years old, and she was running a research operation better than most adults Grayson had worked alongside. He didn't tell her that. He didn't want to make her self-conscious about it. The coupe stayed on the trailer for the first 4 days because Grayson couldn't justify taking up floor space in the garage until he knew whether the research was going anywhere real. Dale Pruitt came to pick up his truck on Thursday as promised, glanced at the rust-eaten thing on the trailer and said, "You hauling that to the crusher?" "Not yet." Dale looked at it a moment longer with the flat assessment of a man who had dealt with enough broken machinery to recognize a lost cause. "Huh," he said, and got in his truck and left. Marta Delgado came for her Civic the same afternoon. She was a small, energetic woman who taught 4th grade and had the habit of talking in complete, organized paragraphs as if she were addressing a classroom at all times. She looked at the coupe and said, "Is that European? The body style looks European." Grayson looked at her, mildly surprised. "You know cars?" "My father did. He used to take me to shows when I was little, that roofline." She tilted her head. "Something about the roofline." "Yeah," Grayson said. "Something about the roofline." Marta paid him in cash, thanked him twice, and drove away. And Grayson stood in the lot watching the Civic go and thinking about the roofline and what it meant that 2 different people in one afternoon had found themselves stopped by the shape of that car. By the end of the first week, he and Sophie had established 2 things with reasonable confidence. First, the badge hole spacing on the front valance was consistent with the documented markings of a coach building atelier called Maison Ferraud, which had operated out of Lyon, France, between 1947 and 1955. Second, the engine configuration, while heavily corroded and not fully accessible without disassembly, appeared to match the specifications of a twin-cam inline-4 that Maison Ferraud had sourced from a small competition-focused engineering firm in Turin for a single prototype project in 1951. There had been exactly 1 Maison Ferraud prototype built to that specification. It had been commissioned for the 1952 season of a major European endurance racing circuit. It had never raced. The coach builder had gone into financial difficulty, the racing program had been abandoned, and the prototype had been sold to a private buyer in 1954. Reportedly, an American oil industry figure who was never conclusively identified in any of the documentation that Sophie had managed to locate. An American oil buyer. Mid-50s. Texas. Grayson sat with that for a long time one evening, the notebook open in front of him, the kitchen quiet because Sophie had gone to bed at 9:30 after falling asleep at the table over a French motorsport journal. She'd been trying to read through an online translation tool. He'd carried her to bed. She was small enough still, just barely, that this was possible. And come back to the kitchen and sat with the open notebook and the particular quality of silence that arrives after a child falls asleep in a house. An American oil buyer. Douglas Langford's father, Serena's grandfather, had been in the oil industry in Texas in the 1950s. That wasn't unusual. Half the serious money in Texas in the 50s had come from oil. But it was a thread, and threads were what you pulled when you didn't have anything more substantial. The problem was that pulling that particular thread required talking to Serena Langford, and Grayson wasn't ready to do that. Not yet. Not without more. He needed someone who knew this specific corner of automotive history better than he did, and he needed that person to look at the car before anyone with money or legal interest got involved. He understood, not because he was cynical, just because he was realistic. That once a potential valuation entered the picture, everything got complicated fast. He needed a clean assessment first. He called Phil Duchamp and asked if Phil knew anyone in the vintage European racing car authentication world. Phil said he'd ask around. 3 days later, Phil called back with a name. A man named Bernard Achterberg, who taught automotive history at a university in Houston and consulted privately for auction houses on pre-war and early post-war European vehicles. Is he expensive? Grayson asked. He's not cheap, but he owes me one from a job in Galveston 2 years ago. I can probably get him to do an initial consultation for travel expenses only. Set it up, Grayson said. Bernard Achterberg arrived on a Saturday morning, having driven from Houston in a sensible gray sedan, and he was not what Grayson had pictured. He was in his mid-60s, heavy-set, with a white beard that had gone slightly yellow around the edges, and the unhurried manner of a man who had spent decades being right about things and no longer felt any urgency to prove it. He wore a short-sleeved button-down shirt and carried a camera bag and a flat case of documentation tools, magnifying lenses, UV light, measuring instruments, reference catalogs in a language Grayson couldn't read. He shook Grayson's hand without much ceremony and looked at the coupe, which Grayson had moved into the garage by then and partially cleaned, removing loose surface rust and decades of accumulated grime from the exterior with careful, non-abrasive methods, enough to reveal the underlying body lines more clearly without touching anything that might constitute evidence. Achterberg walked around it once without speaking. Then he crouched at the front valance and looked at the badge holes for what felt like a very long time. Sophie was in the garage, sitting on the workbench with her notebook, watching. She'd insisted on being there, and Grayson hadn't argued. "You cleaned it," Achterberg said. "Not an accusation, just an observation. Surface only. Nothing chemical, nothing abrasive. I used compressed air and soft cloths." Achterberg nodded without looking up. "Good." He opened his flat case and took out a magnifying lens and a small flashlight. He examined the badge holes. Then he moved to the driver's door and looked at the sill stamp. He spent a long time at the engine. Grayson had left the hood propped, crouching, straightening, moving his flashlight across the corroded components, with the patience of a man reading a text in a difficult language. Sophie watched all of this with her notebook open and her pen in her hand, not writing, just holding it. Grayson stood near the garage door with his arms crossed and his expression carefully neutral, because he'd learned a long time ago that wanting something to be true had a way of making you see evidence that wasn't there, and he didn't want this too much yet. After about 45 minutes, Achterberg straightened up from the engine bay and looked at Grayson. "The chassis number," he said. "You found a partial on the rail. Passenger side front, partially legible." "Show me." Grayson took him to it. The section of chassis rail visible through the wheel well, where he'd photographed the partial stamp. Achterberg crouched with his flashlight and his magnifying lens and was silent for a long time. When he stood up, he didn't say anything immediately. He walked back to his case and exchanged the lens for a reference catalog, a thick spiral-bound document that looked photocopied from something much older. He opened it to a specific page and held it next to the photograph on Grayson's phone, comparing. The garage was very quiet. Outside, a truck went by on the Caliche Road. Sophie had put her pen down. "The partial sequence," Achterberg said slowly, "is consistent with the documented chassis number of the Maison Ferrou Type 52 prototype. The second and fourth digit groupings match. The third grouping is obscured, but the visible characters don't contradict." He looked up from the catalog. "That's not confirmation. You understand that?" "I understand that," Grayson said. "Full confirmation requires a complete chassis number verification, metallurgical dating of the key structural components, authentication of the engine against the Turin supplier's production records, and a provenance chain that accounts for the vehicle's whereabouts from its sale in 1954 to the present day." He paused. "All of those things are possible. None of them are quick and none of them are inexpensive." "How long?" "For a proper authentication package that would satisfy a major auction house or museum? 3 to 4 months, minimum. The engine records are in Italy, and access requires a formal request through the relevant archive. The metallurgical work needs a specialist lab. There's one in Stuttgart and one in the UK that does this level of historical vehicle analysis." Grayson nodded slowly. And if it authenticates fully, what are we talking about in terms of valuation? Achterberg looked at the car again. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Mr. Cole, the last confirmed transaction involving an authenticated one-of-one European racing prototype from this period, a vehicle with a documented competition history, even an incomplete one, was somewhere north of $7 million. That was 4 years ago at auction. He paused. The Maison Ferraud prototype is more significant than that vehicle, if it is what it appears to be. It's been missing for 70 years. The story alone adds value that's difficult to quantify. Sophie made a small sound. Just a breath, really. She pressed her lips together and looked at her notebook. Grayson didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the car, at the rust and the caved quarter panel and the cracked windshield and the wheel wells eaten through with corrosion. He looked at all of it. Okay, he said. Tell me how to start the authentication process. Achterberg told him. It took another hour, Grayson taking notes on a legal pad, asking questions that were specific and practical and sometimes revealed a gap in his knowledge that he filled without embarrassment. Sophie asked 2 questions of her own, one about the Turin archive access process, and one about whether the UV light examination of the body panels had revealed anything. And Achterberg answered both with the same directness he'd given Grayson, which Grayson noticed and appreciated. When Achterberg left, shaking hands again and promising to email the contact information for the Stuttgart laboratory and the Italian archive liaison, the garage felt different, not larger, not brighter, just different, the way a space feels when something important has happened in it that hasn't fully resolved yet. Sophie was quiet for a while, sitting on the workbench. Grayson was cleaning the documentation tools he'd borrowed, a habit, keeping things in order even when his mind was elsewhere. Dad? Sophie said. Yeah. Are we going to be okay, like, financially, until this gets sorted out? He looked at her. She wasn't asking out of fear exactly, more out of the practical awareness she'd developed from living in a house where money was a regular subject, even when it wasn't discussed directly. She was 12, and she knew what rent was, and she knew what a slow week looked like. We're going to be fine, Kat, he said. Then, because she deserved better than a deflection. We've got work lined up through the end of the month. The authentication is going to cost money we'll have to manage carefully, but we're not in a dangerous place, okay? Okay. She looked at the coupe. It's kind of weird to look at it now. Yeah. Like, it's the same car it was this morning, but it's different. It hasn't changed, he said. What changed is what we know. She considered this with the seriousness she brought to things that were actually worth being serious about. I think that's kind of the whole point of research, she said finally. He didn't argue with that. The next 8 weeks were the kind of weeks that don't make good stories in the telling, but are exhausting to live through. Grayson handled his regular work. There was always regular work, the stream of vehicles and hauling jobs that kept the lights on, while simultaneously managing the authentication process, which turned out to involve more correspondence than he'd anticipated, and a level of institutional bureaucracy that tested his patience in ways he hadn't expected. The Stuttgart laboratory was efficient but formal, requiring documentation of ownership, which meant a paper trail from Serena's gift, which meant a conversation with Serena that he'd been putting off. He called her assistant first, left a message that was brief and deliberately vague, saying only that he had questions about the vehicle she'd given him and needed to establish a formal transfer of ownership for documentation purposes. The assistant called back inside an hour. Serena called back inside 2. Mr. Cole. Her voice on the phone was measured. My assistant said you need ownership documentation for the car from the Bastrop warehouse. Yes, ma'am. For a restoration project I'm undertaking. Some of the historical verification processes require proof of ownership chain. There was a brief silence. Is there something about the car I should know? He'd thought carefully about how to handle this. He was not, by nature or practice, a deceptive person. It didn't suit him, and it wasn't something he'd ever wanted Sophie to observe from up close. But he also understood that unverified information spread fast and changed things in ways that were hard to control. I think it may have some historical interest, he said. I'm having it looked at. Once I know more concretely, I'll be transparent with you. Another silence, longer this time. He could hear something in the background on her end, an interior space, climate-controlled, distant voices. "Are you telling me that car might be worth something?" she said. "I'm telling you I don't know yet, and I'm finding out," he said, "and I'm asking for ownership documentation so I can continue the process properly." The silence that followed this was different from the others. "The documentation won't be a problem," she said carefully, "but I'd like to be kept informed. When I have something confirmed to tell you, I will tell you," he said. "I think that's fair." She seemed to consider this. "All right," she said, and there was something in it. Not quite wariness, more like recalibration, the sound of a person revising an assumption they'd been comfortable with. "I'll have my attorney draw up a formal gift transfer document. You'll have it by end of week." He thanked her. She said goodbye with a tone that was harder to read than any of their previous interactions. The document arrived by courier on Thursday. It was thorough, more thorough than he'd expected, which told him that she'd had her attorney look closely at what a formal gift transfer of a potentially significant vehicle required. He wasn't bothered by that. Thoroughness was appropriate. He signed where indicated, had it notarized at the bank in Harlow, and sent it back. The Stuttgart lab received their package, photographs, measurements, and a small sample of metal from a non-critical corroded section of the undercarriage that Ochterberg had supervised the removal of, at the end of week 3. The Italian archive liaison proved to be a retired man named Gianluca Ferri, who communicated exclusively by email in a mixture of Italian and English, and who took 12 days to respond to any given message, but who, when he did respond, was meticulous and genuinely enthusiastic about the inquiry. He informed Grayson in one email, been aware of the missing Maison Ferraud prototype for decades. He had a file on it. He would be very interested in the relevant documentation. In week 5, the Stuttgart lab returned their preliminary findings. The metal samples dated consistently with mid-century European production. The alloy composition matched specifications recorded for French coach-building operations of the relevant period. It was not conclusive, the lab was careful to say so, but it was consistent. Grayson read the report twice at the kitchen table, then put it in the folder with everything else. He didn't tell anyone outside the house. Not Phil Duchamp, not Marta Delgado, not his cousin Ricky, who helped with the hauling trailer. He told Sophie everything because she was his partner in this and had been from the first night, and because she was the only person he fully trusted to hold uncertain information without either catastrophizing or getting ahead of it. Sophie received the Stuttgart report with characteristic composure. She read it carefully, asked one question about the confidence interval in the alloy dating, and then added it to her section of the notebook under confirmed, partial, and said, "What's next?" What was next was Gianluca Ferri in Italy, who came through in week 6 with something extraordinary. In the Turin engineering firm's production records, partially digitized, partially existing only as physical documents that Ferri had access to through a professional relationship with the archive, there was a specification sheet for a twin-cam inline-4 unit built to custom order in 1951. The sheet listed the commissioning client as Maison Ferraud, Lyon. It listed a serial number for the engine. And the serial number, when Ochterberg examined the engine block the following weekend with better cleaning equipment and better light, was there, corroded but present, matching all visible digits. Ochterberg sat in the garage afterward and was quiet for a moment before he spoke. "I've been doing this for 31 years, he said. "I want to be clear that the complete provenance chain still needs to be established and documented before this can be formally authenticated for market purposes. But speaking personally," he paused. He looked at the car. "I believe this is it. I believe this is the car." Grayson was sitting on an overturned bucket near the workbench. Sophie was on the workbench itself, legs hanging. Neither of them said anything immediately. "How long for the full authentication package?" Grayson asked. "Another 6 to 8 weeks at minimum. The provenance chain from the 1954 sale to the present will be the hardest part. If the buyer was connected to the Langford family, we need documentation of that connection. Estate records, purchase documents, anything that places the vehicle in their possession." "I'll need to talk to Serena Langford again," Grayson said. Achterberg nodded. "Yes, and her family's estate records, if she's willing to provide access. The 1954 sale documentation, if it exists anywhere. You understand this may not be comfortable for her." "I know," Grayson said. What he meant was, he knew it wasn't going to be a comfortable conversation for either of them. He drove to Austin 2 weeks later. He hadn't told Serena specifically what the meeting was about, only that he had findings to share regarding the vehicle and would prefer to do it in person. She'd agreed to the meeting with less hesitation than he'd expected, which told him she'd been thinking about it since their phone call. Her office was in a glass and limestone building near downtown, the kind of space that communicated wealth not through ostentation, but through the particular quality of its silence and light. The reception area had the careful airlessness of a place where nothing was allowed to be out of order. A young man in a well-cut suit offered Grayson water and directed him to a chair, and Grayson sat in the chair in his cleanest jeans and a button-down he'd ironed that morning, and he waited. Serena came out to meet him herself rather than having someone escort him, which he noted. She was in a dark blazer, her hair down this time, and she looked at him with an alertness that hadn't been there in the warehouse. A sharpness, like she'd been thinking about this meeting and hadn't fully resolved how she felt about it. "Mr. Cole," she said. "Miss Langford." He shook her hand. "Thank you for seeing me." She led him to a conference room with a long table and windows looking out over downtown Austin, and offered him coffee, which he accepted, and they sat across from each other with the city behind her and the folder of documentation on the table in front of him. He didn't build up to it. He was not a person who found it useful to build up to things. "I believe the car you gave me is the Maison Ferrou type 52 prototype," he said. "The only one built. It disappeared from documented records in 1954 after being sold to a private American buyer. Based on the timeline and the vehicle's presence in your family's warehouse, we believe that buyer was likely connected to your family, possibly your grandfather." Serena looked at him. She didn't say anything for a moment. Her expression went through something, not quite shock, more like the particular stillness of a person recalibrating very quickly. "What does that mean in terms of the car's value?" she said. He respected that she went there directly. Preliminary estimates from specialists put it somewhere in the range of $8 to $10 million, possibly more at auction, depending on verified provenance and condition after professional conservation. The room was very quiet. The city outside moved silently behind the glass. "And I gave it to you," Serena said. Not as an accusation, as a statement, flat and precise, carrying its own weight. "You did. Because everyone thought it was worthless." "Yes." She looked at the table, then out the window, then back at him. There was a quality to the silence that Grayson recognized. It was the silence of a person sitting with something they'd done and finding it uncomfortable to look at directly. "The ownership transfer document," she said. "You had it done formally." "I did." "So legally, it's mine," he said, and he said it without hardness, just as a fact. "But I'm sitting here telling you what I found, which I said I would do, and that's what I'm doing." She looked at him for a long moment. He met her gaze without difficulty. He wasn't angry at her. He wasn't performing anything. He was just a man who had found a thing that was his and was being honest about what the thing was. Because honesty was the only way to operate in a situation like this without it going wrong in ways that couldn't be fixed later. "Why are you telling me?" she asked finally. Not suspiciously, genuinely. "Because you deserve to know," he said. "And because the car's provenance probably runs through your family's history. I need access to estate records to complete the authentication. I'm asking for your cooperation." Serena was quiet. She looked at the folder on the table. "Can I look at those?" He pushed the folder across to her. She read slowly and carefully, the way people read when they're actually absorbing rather than just looking. She spent a long time on the Stuttgart report and a long time on Gianluca Ferri's email and the accompanying documentation. When she closed the folder, she rested her hands on it and didn't speak immediately. "My grandfather had a collection," she said. "He traveled in Europe in the early 50s. Oil and aviation contacts. My father always said the collection was mostly junk. He didn't have much patience for cars." She paused. "Nobody ever cataloged it properly. Nobody looked." "Somebody looked," Grayson said, not unkindly. She glanced up at him. "Yes." A long breath. "I'll give you access to the estate records. Everything I can find from that period." She paused again. Mr. Cole, I owe you an apology. You don't need. I laughed. She said it plainly. Or I allowed laughing. In that warehouse. And before that, the way I spoke to you. Like your judgment was something to humor. I want you to know I understand that was wrong. Grayson looked at her across the table. She wasn't performing contrition. She looked like someone who had found something uncomfortable about herself and decided the discomfort was appropriate. I appreciate that, he said. I do. I don't expect it to change anything. It doesn't need to change anything, he said. It's still the right thing to say. Serena looked at him for another moment. Then something in her expression shifted. Not softened exactly, more like it settled, like a thing clicking into a correct position. All right, she said. Let's talk about the estate records. They talked for another 2 hours. Grayson took notes on his legal pad. Serena called her estate attorney partway through and had a 10-minute conversation that resulted in authorization for Grayson and Achterberg to access the relevant archived documents the following week. When they shook hands at the end, by the elevator this time, the young man in the well-cut suit watching from a respectful distance, the dynamic between them was different than it had been in the warehouse. Not comfortable yet, not anything established. Just different, more honest. Grayson drove back to Harlow in the afternoon heat, thinking about Sophie and what he was going to tell her when he got home and how she would respond, which would be with her notebook and her careful handwriting and whatever questions she'd been saving since this morning. He was right. She was at the garage when he pulled up, homework done, sitting on the workbench. How did it go? She asked. She's giving us access to the estate records, he said. Sophie's eyes went to the coupe in its corner of the garage. So we're close. Getting there, he said. Not we're almost done, not we're going to be fine, just getting there, which was honest. Sophie looked at the car for a long moment. The late afternoon light came through the west-facing door and caught the cleaned sections of bodywork, the places where the rust had been carefully surfaced and the underlying metal was beginning to show through. Under the grime and the decades of damage and the weight of being forgotten, the lines of the car were beginning to be visible again, the particular narrowing at the rear. That roofline. It's actually beautiful, Sophie said quietly, almost to herself. Grayson looked at it. He thought about a builder in Lyon in 1951, bending metal to a vision they had for how a racing car should move through air. He thought about the decades the car had spent in a warehouse being gradually overtaken by rust while people walked past it and saw junk. Yeah, he said. It is. He hadn't let himself say that before now. It felt, at this particular moment, like something he'd earned the right to say. The estate records were stored in a climate-controlled room on the 14th floor of a law firm in downtown Austin, in archival boxes that had been transferred from the Langford family home in Houston when Douglas Langford's estate was settled 18 months earlier. Nobody had opened most of them since. The attorney who'd handled the estate, a careful, silver-haired man named Aldridge, who smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and spoke in the measured cadences of someone accustomed to saying important things slowly, had supervised their transfer to storage with the thoroughness his fee required and had not, he admitted to Grayson, imagined anyone would want to look at them again in the near future. Most estate records of this kind exist for legal protection purposes, Aldridge told him on the morning Grayson and Achterberg arrived, not because anyone expects them to become relevant. Most of them probably don't, Grayson said. Aldridge showed them to the room, explained the organization system, loosely chronological, grouped by category, labeled in a handwriting that turned out to belong to Douglas Langford's personal secretary who had retired in 2019, and left them with a paralegal named Tomas who would be present throughout and could assist with copying anything they needed. The room smelled like old paper and something chemical from the archival materials, and it was cold enough that Grayson wished he'd brought a second layer. Achterberg, who had apparently done this before in less comfortable conditions, produced a cardigan from his camera bag without comment and put it on. They started with the boxes labeled 1950 to 1960, property and acquisitions. There were 4 of them. The work was slow and unglamorous. Most of what the boxes contained was exactly what you'd expect from the business records of a mid-century Texas oil family. Contracts, correspondence, land acquisition documents, tax filings, receipts for equipment and services. Letters from lawyers and bankers and business partners. Grayson read carefully and quickly, the way he'd learned to read automotive documentation, not looking for what he expected to find, just reading everything and letting the relevant materials surface. Achterberg worked the box from the other end, moving backward from 1960. Tomas sat at a small desk near the door and read something on his phone and said nothing, which Grayson appreciated. At 11:45, Achterberg said quietly, "Come look at this." Grayson moved to his side of the table. Achterberg was holding a letter, handwritten on cream stationery, in French. The letterhead at the top contained a name, Maison Ferraud, Lyon, and a date, March 12, 1954. "Can you read it?" Grayson asked. "Well enough." Achterberg set the letter flat on the table and read it slowly, his finger moving beneath the lines. "It's addressed to a Mr. E.W. Langford. That would be Edward Walter Langford, Douglas's father, Serena's grandfather. It's confirming the terms of a private sale." He paused, reading. "One motor car, the type 52 prototype, sold as is with full documentation of construction and specifications for a price that's listed here in francs." He did a brief mental conversion, roughly equivalent to $42,000 at the period exchange rate. The room was quiet. The climate system hummed. "Keep going," Grayson said. "It thanks Mr. Langford for his interest and his understanding of the firm's difficult circumstances, and it expresses the hope that the car will find," the phrase is something like, "a worthy home and a future more distinguished than our present misfortunes allow." Achterberg set the letter down and looked at Grayson. "That's your provenance." Grayson picked up the letter and looked at it without touching the writing, just the edges. The handwriting was formal and slightly cramped. The ink faded to a brownish black. Someone had written this in a room in Lyon in March of 1954, and the car had crossed the Atlantic, and then 70 years had happened. And here was the letter in a climate-controlled room in Austin, and the car was in his garage in Harlow. "We need to find the shipping documentation," he said. "Import records. Anything that shows the physical transit." It took another hour and a half, but they found it. A customs broker's file from 1954 tucked into a separate folder near the back of the second box, documenting the import of one motorcar, described as a French-manufactured prototype racing vehicle, through the port of Galveston, consigned to E.W. Langford of Houston, Texas. With it was a brief handwritten inventory note listing the vehicle as having been placed in storage at the family's Bastrop property. Bastrop. Tomas copied everything they needed: the letter, the customs documents, the inventory note, and 3 additional pieces of correspondence from the same period that referenced the purchase, and provided certified copies with the law firm's authentication stamp. Achterberg handled each original with cotton gloves and labeled the copies with the box and folder numbers before Tomas returned them to their places. They were out of the building by 2:30. On the sidewalk outside, in the early October Austin sunshine that was still warm enough to feel like a small kindness after the cold of the archive room, Achterberg stood beside his gray sedan and said, "That's the chain. Sale in Lyon, March 54. Import through Galveston, summer 54. Storage at the Bastrop property, 70 years. Is it enough? Combined with the metallurgical dating and the engine serial number?" Achterberg considered. "I want one more expert opinion on the body construction. There's a specialist in Philadelphia who can work from high-resolution photography without seeing the car in person. If he concurs with my assessment, yes. It's enough. It will satisfy any serious authentication standard." Grayson called Sophie from the parking garage. She answered on the second ring. "We found it," he said. "The sale letter, the shipping records, all of it." The silence on her end lasted about 3 seconds, which for Sophie was a long time. "Okay," she said. Her voice was carefully controlled in the way it got when she was feeling something large and didn't want it to get away from her. "Okay. Are you coming home?" "Leaving now. Be there around 6, and I'll make dinner," she said, which was notable because she rarely offered this, and when she did, it usually meant she needed something to do with her hands. She made chili from a recipe their neighbor, Mrs. Alanis had given them 2 winters ago, imperfect in the way it always was when Sophie made it. Slightly too much cumin, never quite enough time for the flavors to settle. And they ate at the kitchen table with the folder of certified copies between them, and Sophie read every document twice, and she asked about the French letter and what exactly the phrase about a worthy home had sounded like in context. And Grayson told her, and she was quiet for a moment. "I think that's sad," she said finally. "What is?" "The people who built it. They were in financial trouble. They had to sell the only one they ever made, and then the company folded and it just disappeared into somebody's warehouse for 70 years. Grayson thought about this. "Yeah," he said. "It is. But you found it." "We found it." She looked at the documents. "What happens now?" What happened now was the Philadelphia specialist, whose name was Dr. Marcus Webb, and who had a reputation in European coach-built vehicle authentication that Achterberg described as simply unassailable. Webb received a package of high-resolution photographs. Grayson had borrowed a proper camera from Achterberg for the purpose, not just phone photographs, along with the certified provenance documents and Achterberg's preliminary report. He acknowledged receipt in 2 days and said he would respond within 3 weeks. The 3 weeks were hard, not dramatically hard, not falling apart hard, just the grinding, ordinary hard of waiting while life continued around the thing you were waiting for. Grayson took a transmission job on a Dodge Ram that ran long and cost him most of a week. Sophie had a project at school she was stressed about, a presentation on plate tectonics that she rewrote twice because the first version felt too simple and the second version felt too complicated, and Grayson sat at the table with her on 2 different evenings while she talked through the logic of it, less because she needed his help with plate tectonics and more because talking helped her think. The hauling jobs continued. The Calichet Road got a pothole that he reported to the county twice and that remained unfixed. He didn't tell anyone about the car during those 3 weeks. It wasn't a calculated decision, more just a continuation of the caution he'd practiced since the beginning. The understanding that unverified information had a way of spreading and distorting and creating situations that couldn't be undone. Harlow was a town of 4,000 people. He'd lived here 6 years. He knew what happened when something interesting got out. Webb's response came on a Wednesday morning by email, copying Achterberg. Grayson read it twice standing at the kitchen counter before Sophie left for school. He waited until she was gone before he read it a third time because he needed to be sure he was reading it correctly, and he didn't want to show her an expression he hadn't controlled yet. Webb's conclusion, the body construction, panel gauges, welding methodology, and coach building techniques visible in the photographs were consistent with French coach building practices of the early 1950s and specifically consistent with the documented methods of Maison Ferraud as established through comparison with 2 other authenticated vehicles from the same atelier. Combined with the engine serial number, the metallurgical dating, and the provenance documents, Webb was prepared to offer a formal authentication opinion. He recommended a final in-person inspection before issuing his official certificate, which he proposed scheduling at the earliest mutual convenience. At the bottom of the email, in a postscript that was brief enough that it almost didn't register, "I have been aware of the Maison Ferraud Type 52 prototype for most of my professional career. I did not expect to see it in my lifetime. Whatever you decide to do with it, Mr. Cole, please make sure it is cared for properly. These things deserve to survive." Grayson put his phone face down on the counter and looked out the window at the Calichet Road and the cedar trees and the particular flat Texas light of a Wednesday morning in October. He stood there for a while without moving. Then he picked up his phone and called Achterberg. "I got Webb's email," Achterberg said without preamble. "Yeah. He wants to do the in-person inspection before the certificate. That's standard. We can coordinate schedules. It doesn't need to be rushed." "No," Grayson said. "It doesn't." "Grayson." Achterberg's voice was different for a moment, less the professional consultant, more just a man. "You understand what this means now." "I'm working on understanding it," Grayson said honestly. Achterberg made a sound that might have been a short laugh. "Fair enough. We'll talk schedules. Congratulations, for what it's worth from me." "It's worth something," Grayson said. "Thank you for everything." He told Sophie that afternoon, sitting in the garage after she walked over from school with her backpack and her cartography book, which she'd replaced with a new library book about the history of the Silk Road because the cartography subject had been exhausted. He told her straight. Webb's findings. The authentication path forward. What it meant. Sophie listened with the book in her lap and her hands flat on its cover, and she didn't say anything until he was finished. Then she said, "So it's real." "It's real." She looked at the car. It had been in the garage for 2.5 months now, occupying the back corner, half cleaned, the bodywork showing more clearly than it had when it arrived, but still deeply damaged, still carrying 70 years of neglect. She'd walked past it every day after school, done her homework in its presence. She knew the shape of it now the way you know the shape of furniture you've lived with long enough to stop seeing. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he said. "I need to think carefully." "People will offer you a lot of money." "Probably." "Is that what you want? To sell it?" He looked at the car. He thought about the letter from Lyon, the phrase about a worthy home. He thought about what Webb had written at the bottom of his email. He thought about the fact that this car had been built by people who cared about it, who had a vision for what it could be, and that the vision had never been realized, and that 70 years had happened. "I don't know yet," he said again. "That's an honest answer, not a dodge." Sophie nodded slowly. "Okay." She opened her Silk Road book. "Tell me when you do." The authentication was completed formally 6 weeks later when Webb arrived in Harlow. He flew into Austin and drove out, arriving in a rental car that seemed impractical for the Kalishi Road, and spent most of a day with the car and his instruments and his references and his camera. He was a tall, spare man in his late 60s with the slightly distracted air of someone whose attention was perpetually divided between the physical world and whatever he was thinking about, and he moved around the coupe with a careful reverence that was different from Ochterberg's professional efficiency. Something more personal in it, harder to categorize. At the end of his examination, he sat down on the overturned bucket near the workbench and looked at the car for a while without speaking. Sophie was there. She'd asked to be, and neither Webb nor Achterberg had objected, and she sat on the workbench with her notebook and watched Webb's face. "How old are you?" Webb asked her suddenly. She looked up. 12. "You've been involved in this research from the beginning?" "Since the first night," she said. Webb looked at her, then at Grayson, then back at the car. "I'm going to issue the certificate," he said. "Full authentication. Type 52, prototype, manufactured by Maison Ferrot, Lyon, 1951 to 1952. Engine sourced from Turin, acquired by Edward Walter Langford, 1954. Present owner." He looked at Grayson. "Grayson Cole, Harlow, Texas." The garage was quiet. Outside, a truck went past on the road. "Thank you," Grayson said. Webb nodded. He looked at the car once more, and the look on his face was the look of someone saying something internally that they wouldn't say aloud, in the way people sometimes did with things they felt too deeply to make public. Then he stood up, collected his instruments, and went to wash his hands at the garage sink. The certificate arrived by registered mail 10 days later, along with Webb's formal report, 23 pages, documented in exhaustive detail, with photographic references and cross-citations to historical records. Grayson read all of it. Sophie read all of it. He filed it in a proper archival folder and put the folder in the fireproof lockbox he'd bought from a hardware store in Bastrop, along with the certified copies of the provenance documents. And then the world found out. He hadn't planned for it to happen the way it did. Achterberg had mentioned in an offhand professional way that he was going to note the authentication in his academic record, which would appear in an industry publication. Grayson had understood this was coming and hadn't thought much about it. Academic publications were small circulation things, read by specialists. He hadn't anticipated what specialists did when something this significant appeared in their world. The first call came from a man in London who represented a private collector. He'd seen Ochterberg's published note and wanted to discuss acquisition opportunities. Grayson thanked him politely and said he wasn't currently in discussions. The second call came from a journalist in New York who wrote for a publication about vintage automobiles and wanted to do a story. Grayson said he'd think about it and took a number. The third call came from an auction house in New York, one of the major ones, the kind whose names appeared in news reports about paintings selling for amounts that were difficult to conceptualize. They wanted to talk about a potential listing. Their representative, a woman named Claire Ashton, who spoke in the measured, confident tones of someone accustomed to very large transactions, mentioned gently that their preliminary estimate for a vehicle of this significance and provenance would be in the range of $8 to $10 million, possibly higher, depending on condition presentation and market timing. Grayson thanked her and said he'd be in touch. By the end of that week, he'd received 11 calls and 7 emails from parties ranging from private collectors to museum acquisition departments to a film production company that wanted to know if the car's story could be optioned. His phone number had apparently circulated through the relevant world with the speed of things that circulate when they're attached to something genuinely extraordinary. He did not call any of them back immediately. He did not tell Sophie about the volume of calls because he didn't want her to feel the pressure of it before he'd figured out how to hold it himself. He called Phil Duchamp instead. "Holy," Phil said, when Grayson laid out the situation concisely. "I knew you were onto something, but I didn't think... that's..." A long exhale. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet. I'm calling you because you've been in this business longer than I have, and I trust your judgment, and I need someone to talk to." Phil was quiet for a moment. "You need a lawyer. Not the kind that handles regular contracts, the kind that handles significant asset transactions. You got money for that?" "I can figure it out. I know a guy in Dallas. Good reputation, handles art and collectibles law, done some automotive work." "Want the number?" The lawyer's name was Terrence Park, and he was sharp and direct and charged more per hour than Grayson had made in the best weeks he could remember. And Grayson hired him anyway because the alternative was navigating this alone, and navigating this alone would be the wrong kind of stubborn. Terrence reviewed the authentication documents, spoke with Achterberg and Webb, and came back to Grayson with a clear-eyed summary of his situation and his options. "You have a clean title, a complete authentication package, and an asset that multiple serious parties want," Terrence said, in a phone call that Grayson took sitting in his truck in the garage lot because Sophie was inside doing homework, and he needed space to think. "You can sell at private treaty, direct negotiation with a buyer, no auction. You can sell through auction, maximum exposure, competitive bidding, higher potential ceiling but less control, or you can explore non-sale options, long-term loan to a museum, partnership arrangements, things that generate value without transferring ownership. What would you recommend?" Terrence paused. "That depends on what you want. And I don't mean that as a deflection. I mean that the strategy changes significantly based on your priority. If the priority is maximum immediate cash, we go to auction. If the priority is long-term financial stability with some ongoing connection to the vehicle, we look at museum partnership structures. If the priority is something else, you need to tell me what that something else is." Grayson sat in the truck and looked at the garage and thought about what the priority was. He thought about the chili with too much cumin and the library books about subjects nobody had suggested and the school science camp form he'd been carrying for 11 days. He thought about the transmissions and the brakes and the hauling jobs and the accounting at midnight. He thought about what it meant to reach a point where the numbers stopped being a threat and became something else, something manageable, without losing what the hard years had made him into. He thought about the car in a warehouse for 70 years, about the people who'd built it, about what Webb had written. Please make sure it is cared for properly. "The priority," Grayson said, "is that the car ends up somewhere it'll be seen and taken care of, and that my daughter's future is secure, and that I can keep doing the work I actually know how to do, on a scale that lets me help people who are in the place I was." There was a pause on Terrence's end. "Those aren't incompatible priorities," he said. "That's actually a coherent structure. Let me start making calls." He had not yet talked to Serena, not since the Austin meeting, except for a brief email exchange about the estate records and a short acknowledgement when Achterberg's formal note was published. He knew she was aware a discovery of this significance in her family's collection, the authentication of a car she'd given away as a joke. She would have been contacted by the same industry channels that had contacted him, probably before him. She called him on a Thursday evening, which he hadn't expected. He was in the kitchen, the dinner dishes still on the table, Sophie in her room. The caller ID said S. Langford. He answered. "Mr. Cole," she said. "Miss Langford." A pause. "I've been reading about the authentication, and I've been sitting with some things." Her voice was different from the conference room in Austin, less composed, something moving underneath the surface of it. "I owe you more than the apology I gave you before. You don't let me say this." She said it firmly, not unkindly. "Please." He waited. "When I gave you that car, I was laughing at you. Not loudly, not cruelly. I told myself it was generous, actually. I told myself I was doing you a favor. But the truth is that I looked at you and I looked at that car, and I made a decision about both of you inside of about 45 seconds, and I was wrong about both." A brief pause. "The people who work for me laughed, and I let them, and I didn't say anything, and that's mine to own." Grayson said nothing. "I've been thinking about why I did that," Serena continued, "and I don't have a clean answer. I think I was someone who had spent a long time measuring things by how they looked on the surface, and I'd gotten very good at that particular kind of laziness, and I hadn't noticed it was laziness because it had mostly worked." Another pause, shorter. "It stopped working that day." "We all do that," Grayson said. "Look at surfaces. It's faster." "You didn't." "I had reasons not to. Growing up the way I did, you learn fast that the surface isn't the whole picture. It's not a virtue. It's just what I had to learn." Serena was quiet for a moment. "I keep thinking about your daughter," she said. "The way you described her involvement in the research. She's 12? Yeah. And she just got into it with you. From the first night." "She did." He paused. "She's the one who found the archive with the badge documentation. I probably would have gotten there eventually, but she found it." Something in Serena's voice softened in a way he hadn't heard before from her. "You've done something right, Mr. Cole." He didn't know what to say to that. It landed somewhere he wasn't prepared for, and he sat with it for a second before he spoke. "She's made it easy," he said finally. "Some kids make it easy. My father used to say—" She stopped, started again. "He used to say that the best thing about having money was that it meant you never had to look closely at anything if you didn't want to. He thought that was a benefit." A beat. "I'm not sure he was right about that." "No," Grayson said. "I don't think he was." The silence between them was different from the ones before. Not awkward, not strategic, just two people on the phone in the evening, something complicated and honest between them that neither had expected when the day started. "I'm not calling to renegotiate anything," Serena said. "I want to be clear about that. The car is yours. The legal transfer was clean. I'm not that person." "I know," he said. "I'm calling because—" She paused, and he heard something in it that sounded like someone deciding whether to say a true thing. "I think you're going to do something thoughtful with it, and I wanted you to know that I think that, whatever you decide, I haven't decided yet." "I know." A small pause. "I think that's also the right thing." After the call ended, Grayson sat at the kitchen table for a while without moving. The house was quiet. From Sophie's room he could hear the faint sound of music she played while she read. Something low and instrumental, something she'd found on her own. The kind of thing 12-year-olds found when they were given space to find things. He thought about Serena's voice when she'd talked about her father. He thought about a man who'd believed that not having to look closely was a privilege. He thought about all the things in that warehouse that nobody had looked at closely in decades, and about what it had taken to look at one of them. Not special equipment, not professional training at first, just the habit of actually looking. He got up and went to the garage. The coupe sat in its corner in the dark until he clicked on the overhead lights. He'd done no restoration work on it. Ochterberg and Webb had been firm that conservation should wait until after authentication and until proper specialists could be consulted, which was correct. The car sat in the same state it had arrived in, minus the surface grime, the bodywork cleaned enough to see the lines. He pulled a stool over and sat down in front of it. He looked at it for a long time, not trying to figure anything out, not processing the week's phone calls or Terrence's options or Serena's voice, just looking at the car the way he'd first looked at it on the warehouse floor in Bastrop, with the kind of attention that didn't come from wanting something, just from finding something genuinely worth looking at. The lines of it, the particular roofline, the way it got narrow at the rear. Someone had drawn that shape on paper in a room in Lyon before the war in Korea, before television was in every house, before any of the things that had happened since then had happened. And they had believed in it enough to bend metal to match it. And now it sat in his garage in Harlow, Texas, waiting to be seen. He sat with it for a long time. Outside, the mockingbird that had been living in the cedars since August started up again. It was night, which mockingbirds ignored. And the stars over Harlow were what stars over small Texas towns always were, more than you remembered between looks. He wasn't at peace exactly. Peace was too clean a word for what he felt. It was more like clarity, the sensation of being in the right place in a situation he understood, making decisions he hadn't made yet but could see the shape of. Like looking at the car from outside the warehouse and knowing there was something worth stopping for before he'd been able to say why. He'd learned to trust that feeling. It hadn't let him down yet. Terrence Park was not a man who used phrases like life-changing opportunity or once in a generation. He was a transactional attorney who had spent 20 years in high-value asset negotiations and had developed, through that experience, a precise allergy to language that dressed up simple things in complicated clothes. When he called Grayson the following Monday morning with the results of his initial outreach to the relevant parties, he was characteristically direct. "You have 3 serious acquisition interests," Terrence said. "The auction house in New York, Claire Ashton, whom you've already spoken with. A private collector based in Geneva who has authorized his representative to go to $12 million in a direct treaty sale, no public process. And the Hardworking Automotive Museum in Philadelphia, which is a different conversation entirely." Grayson was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he waited for this call. Sophie had left for school 40 minutes earlier. The morning light came through the east-facing window and lay across the table in a long, flat rectangle. "Tell me about the museum," he said. The Harwick is one of the 4 or 5 most significant automotive history institutions in the country. Their collection includes authenticated racing and prototype vehicles from the pre-war era through the 1970s. They have a permanent gallery for European coach-built vehicles that's considered a reference-level collection internationally. Terrence paused. "Their acquisition director contacted me yesterday evening. They're not offering to buy it outright. They don't have the capital for a transaction at this valuation level. What they're proposing is a partnership structure." "What kind of structure?" "Long-term loan agreement. Minimum 25 years. They fund the full professional conservation and restoration of the vehicle. That's a significant cost, given its condition, potentially $300,000 to $400,000 for the level of work it needs. In exchange, the car is displayed permanently in their collection under your name as owner. You retain title. They insure it, maintain it, house it. You receive an annual partnership payment from the museum's endowment fund for the duration of the agreement." "How much annually?" "Their opening figure is $220,000. I think we can negotiate that upward. But here's what's more relevant." Terrence paused the way he paused when he was about to say something he considered important. "If you go this route, you keep the asset. You don't liquidate it. The car appreciates in value over the agreement period. Vehicles of this significance tend to appreciate significantly when they're properly conserved and publicly exhibited. At the end of a 25-year term, you or your heirs can renegotiate, extend, or sell into a market where the car is a known, authenticated, publicly celebrated piece of automotive history. The ceiling on what it would bring at that point is genuinely difficult to estimate." Grayson was quiet. "On the other hand," Terrence continued, "the Geneva collector is offering $12 million now. Liquid, clean. That's a different kind of security." "What would you do?" Grayson asked. Terrence was quiet for a beat. "That's not really my place to—" "I'm asking anyway." Another beat. "If I had a 12-year-old daughter and I was 32 years old, and I had the choice between $12 million now and $200,000 a year for 25 years plus a retained asset that will likely be worth $20 to $30 million in 2 decades? A pause. "I'd want to know what my daughter thought." Grayson almost said something. Instead, he said, "I'll call you back." He didn't call Sophie at school. He waited. He went to the garage and did the work that needed doing. There was a Suburban in for a cooling system problem, straightforward enough, and the physical work helped him think the way it always had. His hands occupied and his mind free to move without forcing itself. He thought about numbers, and about what numbers meant, and about what they didn't mean. And he thought about the car sitting in the corner under the overhead lights, and he thought about what Webb had written. Sophie came through the garage door at 3:45 with her backpack and her library book. The Silk Road had given way to a book about the Byzantine Empire, the current rotation, and she read his expression with the accuracy she'd had since she was small and said, "What happened?" He told her. All of it. The three options, the structures, the numbers. He laid it out the same way he would have laid out a repair estimate, clearly, without editorializing, giving her the real information. She listened standing up, her backpack still on, and she didn't ask him to repeat anything, which meant she'd been following closely enough to catch it the first time. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. She set her backpack down on the workbench and looked at the coupe. "The museum," she said. "Tell me why." "Because it's right." She said it without drama, just plainly. The car should be seen. It should be taken care of properly. It was... She paused, choosing words with the care she brought to things that mattered. It was hidden for 70 years because nobody looked at it. It shouldn't be hidden again in some private collector's garage in Geneva, where only one person ever sees it. "The $12 million is a lot of security," Grayson said. "I know." She looked at him. "But you'd have to live with selling it to someone who's just going to keep it private. Would you be okay with that?" He thought about the letter from Lyon, a worthy home and a future more distinguished than our present misfortunes allow. He thought about that for a moment, and Sophie watched him think about it, and she knew. She'd always been able to read when he'd already made a decision and was just finding his way to the front of it. "No," he said. "I wouldn't be okay with that." "Then we have our answer." It wasn't quite that simple, of course. Nothing was quite that simple. But Sophie had a way of cutting to the center of things that Grayson had learned not to argue with. Not because she was always right. She wasn't. She was 12. She was wrong about plenty of things. But because in the situations where she went quiet and then spoke plainly, she was usually pointing at something real. He called Terrence back that afternoon. "Museum partnership," he said, "but I want to negotiate the annual payment and I want specific conditions in the agreement about conservation standards and public access." Define public access. "I want the car in a public gallery. Not a private viewing room, not a members-only exhibit. I want it where anyone who buys a museum ticket can see it." Terrence made a note sound. "That's a reasonable condition and probably not hard to get. Conservation standards? I want the right to approve the conservation team and the methodology before they start. And I want documentation of the process, photographs, records, that stays with the car's provenance file." Also reasonable. "What's your floor on the annual payment?" $280, Grayson said. "And I want the first payment made within 60 days of the agreement execution, not upon completion of conservation." Terrence was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was running calculations. "I think we can get there. The museum wants this badly enough. The Maison Ferrot prototype fills a gap in their European collection that they've been trying to address for 15 years. "Then let's do it," Grayson said. The negotiation took 3 weeks. It was not, as Terrence had predicted, particularly difficult. The Harwick's acquisition director, a woman named Dr. Priya Nair, who communicated with a kind of precise enthusiasm that Grayson found both exhausting and likable, wanted the car more than she was initially able to conceal, and Terrence was good at his job. The final agreement landed at $265,000 annually, the conservation team subject to joint approval, full documentation rights to Grayson, and a public gallery commitment written into the contract language. The first payment would arrive within 45 days of signing. Grayson signed the agreement on a Tuesday morning in Terrence's Dallas office, which required a 4-hour round trip that he managed around a brake job in the morning and a fuel system problem in the afternoon. He sat across from Terrence and the Harwick's attorney, a young man named Derek, who clearly found the whole thing exciting and was trying not to show it. And he read the full document before signing it, which took 40 minutes and which nobody rushed him on, and then he signed his name 7 times in various places and shook the hands that needed shaking. In the car on the way back to Harlow, he called Sophie. It's done, he said. She was in the middle of something at school. He could hear the ambient sound of an interior space, other voices at a distance. She dropped her voice to the tone she used when she was somewhere she wasn't supposed to be on her phone. The museum deal? Yeah. Okay. A pause, still quiet, still in that almost whispered register. Dad? Yeah. Okay. She said it again, and this time it meant something different, something fuller. I gotta go. I'll see you at the garage. He drove back through the flat stretch of highway between Dallas and home with the radio off, thinking about $265,000 a year and what that meant measured against what his life had looked like 3 months earlier. The $1,100 weeks, the science camp form he'd been carrying for 11 days, the accounting at midnight when the numbers refused to cooperate. He didn't feel euphoric. He felt something quieter and more durable than euphoria. He felt like a man who had made a decision he could live with for the next 25 years and beyond. There was still the question of the garage and the house and the immediate situation, which the first payment would address significantly, but which required some thought before it arrived. He had a conversation with Terrence about structuring, what to set aside, what to address immediately, what to think about longer term. Terrence referred him to a financial advisor he trusted, a straightforward woman named Angela Reyes, who worked out of San Antonio and who met with Grayson twice and asked good questions and didn't try to make simple things complicated. With Angela's guidance, Grayson built a plan. The immediate debts, the garage rent arrears he'd been managing with careful timing, a small medical bill from 2 summers ago that he'd been paying down in installments, the equipment loan he'd taken for a tire machine he needed, all of it gone inside the first 30 days. After that, the structure he'd been thinking about since the conversation with Terrence on the phone. Expand the repair business, properly. Not into something unrecognizable, not into a chain or a franchise, just into a version of itself that was stable and staffed and didn't require Grayson to be the only person holding it together. He hired his first employee in January, a young mechanic named Dario, who was 23 and capable and had been working at a shop in Gonzales where the owner underpaid him and took credit for work he didn't do. Grayson paid him a fair wage and told him straight on the first day, "I'm not going to micromanage your work, but I'm going to tell you when something isn't right, and I expect the same from you. If you see something I'm doing wrong, say it." Dario had looked at him for a second like he was assessing whether this was real or performance. Then he'd nodded. "Yeah, okay." It was real, as it turned out, and Dario figured that out inside of 2 weeks and settled into the work with the ease of someone who had been waiting for a job that treated him like a person. By spring, he was one of the most reliable things in Grayson's day. Sophie's school situation changed. Grayson didn't yank her out of Harlow Middle and put her somewhere expensive and distant. She'd have resisted that, and he respected that resistance. What he did was find an online academic enrichment program that was rigorous in the ways she needed and flexible enough to work around a regular school schedule, and he sat down with her one evening and laid it out. "This is optional," he said. "I'm not signing you up for something you don't want." She looked at the program description. She asked several specific questions about the curriculum structure and the time commitment and whether the writing components were evaluated by actual people or automated systems. When she'd satisfied herself on these points, she said, "Okay, I'll try it." She didn't just try it. By the second month, she was doing supplementary reading that wasn't on the syllabus and emailing one of the program's instructors with questions the instructor described in a note to Grayson as unusually sophisticated for her age group. Grayson read that note twice and then put it in the folder where he kept things he wanted to remember, which was not a folder he showed anyone. The science camp form, the one that had been in his jacket pocket for 11 days, folded soft at the creases. He eventually found it in a drawer where it had ended up when he'd emptied the jacket pocket one night. He sat with it for a moment, looking at the $240 cost. Then he threw it away because the registration window had long since closed. He found Sophie a better science program the following summer, a 2-week residential course at a university in San Antonio, and when he told her about it, she went very still in the way she did when something mattered more than she wanted to show. 2 weeks? She said. "You'd stay in the dorms. There are other kids from all over the state." She looked at the program description on his phone. She was quiet for a moment. "Can I think about it?" Of course. She thought about it for one day and then said yes. The community program was the thing Grayson had been thinking about since the phone call with Terrence, since the night in the garage looking at the car's lines, maybe since longer than that. It had been in the background of his thinking for years, a shapeless awareness of what it had felt like to be the person who couldn't sign the form, who did the accounting at midnight, who carried the weight of a situation that more money would have made navigable. He knew what that felt like from the inside, and he knew that money wasn't a cure for everything wrong in a life, but that the absence of it created specific, concrete problems that could be addressed with specific, concrete help. He started small and stayed small deliberately. A fund, administered through the county's existing social services framework, that provided emergency assistance for working families in situations he recognized. An unexpected car repair that was keeping someone from getting to work. A utility bill that had tipped into shutoff territory. A school fee or medical copay that was technically small and practically insurmountable. He worked with the county coordinator, a steady woman named Esperanza, who had been doing this work for 14 years and had opinions about which kinds of assistance actually helped people and which kinds generated dependency and paperwork without changing anything real. You want to help people get back on their feet, or you want to feel good about helping? Esperanza asked him bluntly at their first meeting. Grayson looked at her. The first one. Good, because the second one is easier and less useful. She leaned back in her chair. Here's what we need, and here's what works in this county. You ready to listen? He was ready to listen. He listened for 2 hours and took notes and came back 2 weeks later with a structure that Esperanza said was actually sensible, which is rarer than you'd think. The fund didn't have a name. Grayson had thought about naming it and decided against it. It was a mechanism, not a monument. It moved quietly through the county's existing systems, flagged by Esperanza's team when situations arose that fit the criteria, money appearing in the places it needed to appear without ceremony. Grayson knew some of the families it helped and didn't know most of them, which was how he wanted it. By April, the Harwick Museum's conservation team had taken possession of the car. The team lead was a conservator named Helene, Belgian by birth, who had worked on vehicles for 3 major European collections before relocating to the United States, and who brought to her work the particular combination of technical rigor and genuine reverence that the car deserved. She'd spent 2 days in Harlow before transport, examining the vehicle in Grayson's garage and photographing every detail before a single thing was touched, and she'd talked to Grayson during this process about what she was seeing and what she was planning with the directness of someone who expected her counterpart to follow along. The body panels are recoverable, she told him, better than I expected given the surface corrosion. The caved section in the rear quarter, that's structural work, not cosmetic, and we'll need to discuss methodology carefully because there's a school of thought that says you restore it and a school of thought that says you conserve it, and the choice has implications for historical integrity. What's the difference? Grayson asked. Restoration means returning it to running condition, or as close as possible to its original appearance. Conservation means stabilizing what's there, arresting further deterioration, without trying to reverse 70 years of history. A conserved vehicle shows its age. A restored vehicle looks, she considered, like it just came off the factory floor. What would you recommend? Helene looked at the car. This car never raced. It was built for something that didn't happen. Its story includes the 70 years in the warehouse. That's part of what it is. She paused. I would conserve it, not restore it. I would make it stable, safe, beautiful in the way that honest things are beautiful. But I would not pretend the time didn't happen. Grayson looked at the car. He thought about what she'd said for a moment. Do it that way, he said. She nodded once, as if she'd expected this answer and was satisfied by it. Good. The car left Harlow on a flatbed transport truck on a Thursday morning in April, strapped down carefully with Helene supervising every strap placement, the whole process documented by her team's photographer. Grayson and Sophie stood in the lot and watched the truck go down the Caliche Road and turn onto the county highway and disappear. Sophie had her notebook. She hadn't written anything in it. She was just holding it, the way she held things when she needed something in her hands. How do you feel? She asked. Strange, he said honestly. Like I did the right thing, and it still feels like a loss. Because you got used to it being here. Yeah, she nodded. I did too. She looked at the empty corner of the garage where the car had sat for months. But it's going somewhere it'll matter. Yeah, he said. It is. The strange feeling didn't last long. Life has a way of filling in the spaces that things leave, not by replacing them, but by continuing. And Grayson's life continued with a steadiness he hadn't known before. Not ease, not leisure, just steadiness. The work. Dario at the garage, Sophie at her school, and her programs and her library books that rotated through subjects with the reliable enthusiasm of a person who would never run out of things to find interesting. The first Harwick Museum newsletter arrived by email in May, featuring a 2-paragraph note from Dr. Nair about the upcoming exhibition of the Maison Ferrot prototype, currently undergoing conservation, expected to be on public view by autumn. Grayson read it at the kitchen table and forwarded it to Sophie, who was in San Antonio at her 2-week university program. She replied within 10 minutes, "That's really well written. They got the story right." He smiled at his phone and put it down and finished his coffee. The media attention had come and mostly gone, as media attention did. There had been an article in the automotive publication whose journalist had called months earlier, a long, well-researched piece that Grayson had given one interview for and that Sophie had declined to be named in, which he'd respected. There had been a mention in a national newspaper, a brief segment on a television program about antique valuables that Grayson had agreed to only because Achterberg said it would help establish the public record of the authentication, which was useful for the provenance history. He'd sat in front of a camera in his garage in his cleanest clothes and answered the questions clearly and briefly, and the segment was fine, and then it was over. What he noticed was how little the attention changed the actual texture of his days. The garage still smelled like grease and oil. Dario still showed up at 7:30 and made terrible coffee in the new machine Grayson had bought for the break room and talked too much about the basketball team he followed. The Kalish Road still had the same pothole, which had now been there since October and which Grayson had stopped reporting to the county because clearly the county had decided to live with it. Sophie still walked over from school and did her homework at what was now a proper desk rather than a folding table, a real desk with a lamp, in the corner of the garage that used to be storage. One evening in June, Grayson was working late on a Ford Ranger with an exhaust leak that was more complicated than it had initially appeared, and he had the radio on low in the background. And Sophie was at her desk doing something for her enrichment program, and Dario had gone home an hour earlier. It was the kind of evening that didn't have anything particularly notable about it, except that it was quiet and the work was honest and the air coming through the garage door smelled like cedar and warm calichet. And Sophie looked up from her desk at some point and said, "Do you ever think about where we'd be right now if you hadn't stopped to look at that car?" He thought about it. The question deserved an actual answer. "Yeah, I think about it sometimes." "Where would we be?" "I'd probably be doing this job right now," he said, "just without Dario. And you'd be at the kitchen table instead of that desk." He paused, "And that science camp form from last fall would still be in my jacket pocket." Sophie considered this. "The one you never signed?" "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. "Was it hard, carrying it around and not signing it?" He looked at her across the garage. She was asking the real question, the one underneath the surface question, and she was old enough now to ask it directly and young enough that it still cost her something to do it. "Yeah," he said. "It was hard." She nodded slowly, looking at her screen. "Okay." A pause. "I kind of figured. I didn't want you to worry about it." "I know, I kind of figured that too." She looked over at him, her expression carrying the complicated mix of things that 12 going on 13 carried. Not quite a child's trust anymore. Not yet the fully armored self-sufficiency that came later. Something in between that was its own particular kind of honest. "You could have told me." "Maybe," he said. "Probably." "I wouldn't have freaked out." "No, you don't freak out." She turned back to her screen. "I just think—" She paused. "If we're doing things together, we should probably do all of it together. The hard parts, too." Grayson set down his wrench. He looked at his daughter at her proper desk with her lamp on in the corner of the garage, her dark hair falling forward over her work, And he thought about Carla leaving when Sophie was 3 and all the years since, and the particular thing that had been built in the space that left, which was a thing he hadn't expected and couldn't have designed, and which was, he understood, the most valuable thing in his life by a distance that made the car seem ordinary. "Yeah," he said. "You're right, all of it together." She didn't make a big deal of it, which was her way. She just nodded slightly and kept working, and he picked up his wrench and went back to the exhaust leak, and the radio played something low in the background, and the cedar and calichet smell drifted through the garage door, and outside the mockingbird that had moved from the far cedars to the closer ones kept up its complicated nighttime conversation with itself. It was, Grayson thought, a completely ordinary evening. And he'd gotten to the point where ordinary evenings felt like something to be deliberately noticed, because he'd had enough years of ordinary evenings that were darkened by what he couldn't fix to understand that an ordinary evening without that shadow was not ordinary at all. He went back to work. The leak was in the flange between the manifold and the front pipe, a hairline crack that had been leaking exhaust gas into the engine bay and would eventually become a safety issue. He'd have it fixed inside the hour, clean and solid and done right, the way things were supposed to be done. The Harwick Museum's autumn exhibition opened on the second Saturday of October, 14 months after Grayson had loaded a rust-eaten coupe onto a trailer outside a warehouse in Bastrop, while a group of workers laughed behind their hands. He drove to Philadelphia with Sophie, the two of them in his truck. He'd bought a newer one in the spring, nothing extravagant, just reliable, with working air conditioning and a radio that held its presets. And they drove it over 2 days, stopping overnight in Nashville at a motel that Sophie had selected based on its proximity to a used bookstore she'd found online, because she was 13 now and had opinions about road trips. She'd turned 13 in August. He'd taken her to San Antonio for her birthday, her choice, and they'd eaten at a restaurant she'd picked from an online review, a place with mismatched chairs and handwritten menus that served food from 3 different countries in combinations that shouldn't have worked but did. And Sophie had eaten adventurously and talked about her summer university program with the sustained enthusiasm she reserved for things that had genuinely changed something in her. And Grayson had sat across from her and thought, not for the first time, that he was watching someone become themselves, and that it was one of the stranger and more affecting things a person could witness. The Nashville bookstore yielded a paperback history of early aviation and a used copy of a novel Sophie had been wanting, and they ate barbecue for dinner at a place that had been open since 1951 and had the kind of legitimacy that comes only from outlasting everything that tried to replace it, and the next morning they drove the rest of the way to Philadelphia. The museum was in a converted industrial building in a neighborhood that had gone from manufacturing to arts institutions over several decades, the kind of transformation that left interesting architecture in its wake. High ceilings, wide windows, exposed structural elements that had been preserved rather than hidden. Grayson had spoken with Dr. Nair twice by phone during the conservation period and had seen Helene's documentation photographs as they arrived in batches through the spring and summer, so he knew what the car looked like now. But photographs and the thing itself were different in the specific way that had started this whole story. Photographs told you about surfaces, and surfaces weren't the whole picture. They arrived the evening before the opening, when the museum was closed to the public, because Dr. Nair had arranged for Grayson and Sophie to see the car privately before the crowds arrived. This had been Sophie's only stated preference about the trip. "I want to see it without people around," she'd said, and Grayson had made sure it happened. Dr. Nair met them at a side entrance. She was a compact, precise woman with an energy that reminded Grayson of Marta Delgado, the school teacher from Harlow who'd recognized the European body style that first week, and she shook their hands with genuine warmth rather than the professional warmth that was technically the same gesture but felt different on the inside. "We're very glad you're here," she said, and she meant both of them, which Grayson noticed and appreciated. She led them through the back corridors of the museum, past storage areas and a conservation workshop that smelled faintly of the same chemical and old material combination as the Austin Archive Room, and through a door into the European coach-built gallery. The gallery was long and quietly lit, the overhead lights designed to illuminate vehicles without creating harsh reflections, and around its perimeter sat a dozen or so automobiles from the relevant era, pre-war and immediate post-war European machines, coach-built and competition-bred, each one representing something specific from the history of a period when cars were still individual objects made by hands that knew what they were making. The Maison Ferrol Type 52 was at the far end, in its own alcove, slightly set apart from the others. Grayson stopped when he saw it. Sophie stopped beside him. Helene had been true to what she'd said in the garage in Harlow. She had not restored the car. She had conserved it, stabilized it, treated it, brought it back from the edge of further decay into a state of permanent, careful stillness. The rust was gone, treated and sealed. The metal beneath it a deep, complex brown gray that was the honest color of old steel that had been through something. The caved rear quarter had been carefully worked back to structural integrity without being made invisible. You could see it had happened, the slight ghost of the damage still readable in the panel if you knew to look for it. The cracked windshield had been consolidated and sealed rather than replaced. The wheels, properly mounted now on conserved period-correct tires, sat solidly on a low platform that raised the car just slightly off the floor. It looked like what it was. A 70-year-old racing prototype that had been built with complete seriousness and then lost for most of a human lifetime, and then found by someone who understood what it was before anyone told him. It looked, Grayson thought, like the truth about itself. Sophie walked toward it slowly. She circled it once without touching it, the way she'd circled it the first night in the garage in Harlow, only this time she was taller and older, and the car was lit properly, and there was no rust-orange dust in the air. She stopped at the rear where the body narrowed to that particular shape, and she stood there for a moment. "It's better than the photographs," she said quietly. "Yeah," he said. "Helene did the right thing." "Yeah, she did." Sophie turned and looked at him across the length of the car. She had her father's eyes now, he'd been told. She'd always had her mother's, but somewhere in the last year something had shifted and people said she looked like Grayson, which he still didn't quite see but didn't argue with. "Are you okay?" she asked. He thought about it. He'd been thinking about what he'd feel when he saw the car in the museum, and he'd been wrong about what he'd feel, which happened when you tried to predict your own emotional responses from the outside. He'd expected something triumphal, or something like grief, or maybe the particular clean satisfaction of a finished thing. What he actually felt was quieter than any of those, something more like recognition, like seeing a person you'd known briefly but significantly at an unexpected moment, and understanding that the brief time had mattered. "Yeah," he said. "I'm okay." "Doctor." Nair had stepped back to give them the space, which was a considerate thing to do, and she stood near the entrance to the alcove looking at the car with the expression of someone who had been looking at it for months and wasn't finished looking yet. They stood with the car for 40 minutes, the three of them mostly quiet, moving around it, stopping at different points. Grayson found himself at the front valance at some point, looking at the place where the Maison Ferrot badge had been mounted. The holes where it had been removed, still there, the spacing that Sophie had identified in an online archive at 11:30 on a Wednesday night at a kitchen table in Harlow, Texas, with the mockingbird going outside. The holes were small and precise, and they'd been there for 70 years, holding the absence of a badge that had been removed by someone in 1954 for reasons nobody would ever know. He thought about all the specific and improbable chain of events that had led from those holes in a panel to this room in Philadelphia. The hauling job Phil Duchamp had found him. The August heat and the warehouse smell. The particular angle of light in the Bastrop warehouse that had let him see the sill stamp clearly. The 45 seconds that Serena Langford had spent assessing him in the car before deciding both were worth nothing. The 11:30 search session. Sophie finding the archive. Bernard Achterberg owing Phil Duchamp a favor from a job in Galveston. Any of those things could have been different. The chain had so many links, and each one had required something specific, and the whole thing was so contingent that you could make yourself dizzy thinking about it. He'd learned not to spend too much time thinking about it, because the contingency of good things was a thought you could follow into dark places if you weren't careful. What he thought instead, standing in front of those two small holes in a conserved panel in a Philadelphia museum, was something simpler. He'd stopped. He'd looked, and everything else had followed from that. The next morning, the museum opened at 10, and by 10:15 there were people in the European coach-built gallery, and by 11 the alcove holding the Maison Ferraud prototype had a small, steady cluster of visitors at all times. Grayson and Sophie moved through the museum at their own pace, spending time in other galleries, circling back occasionally to the alcove without pushing through the crowd to the front. At one point, Grayson stood at the edge of the cluster and watched people look at the car. There was a man in his 70s who stood for a long time without moving, and Grayson could see from across the room that the man knew what he was looking at. The particular stillness of someone in the presence of something that has meaning for them beyond the visual. There were two children, maybe 8 and 10, who crouched near the front and looked at the undercarriage with the uninhibited curiosity of people who hadn't yet learned to look at museum objects from a proper distance. There was a woman with a professional camera who was taking photographs with the systematic patience of someone who understood that the light would shift and there were angles that wouldn't wait. The exhibition text beside the car, a panel that Dr. Nair had shared with Grayson in draft, and that he'd provided minor corrections to, told the story briefly and factually. The Maison Ferraud Atelier. The 1951-52 construction. The abandoned racing campaign. The 1954 sale to a Texas family. The 70 years in a Bastrop warehouse. The 2025 discovery by an automotive mechanic from Harlow, Texas, who had noticed unusual design details during a routine hauling job. The authentication process. The museum partnership. It did not say, a billionaire's warehouse worker laughed. It did not say, a 12-year-old found the critical archive at 11:30 at night. It did not say, a man carried a science camp form in his pocket for 11 days because the $240 was a problem. Factual exhibition text didn't have room for those details, and Grayson wasn't sure they belonged on a museum wall anyway. They belonged to the story of it, which was a different thing from the official record. Achterberg arrived mid-morning, having driven down from a conference in New York, and he stood with Grayson near the gallery entrance and looked at the car from a distance for a moment without speaking. "It looks right here," Achterberg said finally. "Yeah, it does. Helene's work is exceptional. I told her what I wanted, and she did better than what I could have described." Achterberg nodded. He was quiet for a moment. "You know, when you came to me, or when Phil arranged it, I should say, I had no particular expectation. Enthusiastic amateurs find things they believe are significant fairly regularly. Usually they're wrong." A pause. "You were not wrong. Sophie found the archive," Grayson said. Achterberg glanced at him. "You've mentioned that before." "It's still true. Where is she?" Grayson nodded toward the other end of the gallery, where Sophie was in conversation with one of the museum's education staff, a young woman who'd apparently recognized Sophie from the brief mention in the exhibition text and started talking to her. Sophie was listening with her head slightly tilted, the posture she had when someone was saying something she found genuinely interesting, her notebook in her hand. "She brought the notebook," Achterberg said, mildly amused. "She brings it everywhere." "Smart kid." "Yeah," Grayson said. "She is." Serena arrived at noon. He hadn't been sure she would come. She'd been invited. Dr. Nair had handled that, after Grayson mentioned during one of their planning calls that Serena's family's estate records had been essential to the provenance chain and that her cooperation had made the authentication possible. The museum had extended a formal invitation to the opening. Serena had RSVP'd yes through her assistant 3 weeks earlier, and then Grayson hadn't thought much more about it. She came in through the main entrance with a single assistant, and without the kind of visible entourage that her level of wealth could have warranted. She was in a dark coat over a gray sweater, her hair down, and she looked less like the woman Grayson had met in the warehouse, and less like the woman in the glass and limestone office building in Austin, and more like someone who had been thinking about something for a long time and had decided to come and see it in person. She found Grayson near the gallery entrance. "Mr. Cole," she said. "Miss Langford." He shook her hand. "Thank you for coming." She looked past him toward the alcove. From where they stood, the car was visible over the heads of the cluster of visitors. She looked at it for a moment without speaking. "It's different from what I remember," she said. "Helene did a conservation rather than a restoration. It shows its history." "No, I mean," she paused. "In the warehouse, it was just a piece of junk I couldn't be bothered to look at properly. Now it's—" She didn't finish the sentence. She seemed to decide that finishing it would be overstating something. "It's what it always was," she said instead. "I just didn't know." "Most people didn't know," Grayson said. "You knew." "I suspected." "That's different." She looked at him. "You're going to make that distinction every time anyone says you knew, aren't you?" "Probably," he said. "Because it matters. Knowing is a conclusion. Suspecting is a reason to look closer. They're not the same thing, and confusing them is how people stop looking." She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her turning that over. "My father used to say that successful people trusted their instincts," she said. He meant it as a compliment to successful people. "Instincts are useful," Grayson said. "The problem is when instincts replace looking." Serena glanced at him with something that was almost a smile. "You're harder to argue with than I expected." "I'm not arguing," he said. "I'm just saying what I think." "I know." The almost smile settled into something more genuine. "That's the part that's harder to argue with." Sophie appeared at Grayson's elbow. She'd extracted herself from the education staff conversation and made her way back, her notebook under her arm. She looked at Serena with the calm directness she brought to adults she hadn't met but had heard about. Not rude, just unperformed. "This is my daughter Sophie," Grayson said. "Sophie, this is Serena Langford." Sophie offered her hand, which Grayson had never explicitly taught her to do, but which she'd developed as her own habit. "You had the warehouse," she said. "I did," Serena said, shaking it. She looked at Sophie with the assessment she probably couldn't help bringing to any new person, but softer than it had been in the warehouse, more genuinely curious. "I understand you found the archive documentation." "One of the archives," Sophie said. "My dad found most of it. I just found the one that had the badge spacing." "The badge spacing turned out to be fairly important," Serena said. "It was the thing that confirmed the manufacturer. Without that, we would have gotten there eventually through the engine specs, but it would have taken longer." She paused. "The whole thing is kind of about paying attention to small details." Serena looked at Sophie for a moment, and then she looked at Grayson, and the look had something in it that was difficult to read exactly, but that Grayson understood as the look of a person recognizing something they'd underestimated in its full dimension for the first time. "I think you're right," Serena said to Sophie, "about the small details." "It's kind of the whole story," Sophie said, without any particular weight on it, just as a statement of fact, because it was. The three of them went to look at the car together, Grayson and Sophie and Serena Langford, which was an arrangement that none of them had planned or predicted, and which had its own particular quality of strangeness and rightness at the same time. They stood at the front of the alcove when the crowd around it thinned briefly, and Serena looked at the car the way someone looks at a thing they have to completely rebuild their understanding of, and Sophie looked at it the way she'd always looked at it, with the quiet ownership of someone who had found it with her own hands, who knew it the way you know the things you've worked to understand. "The roofline," Serena said after a moment. "What about it?" Grayson asked. "In the warehouse, I remember thinking it was an odd shape, like it was wrong somehow. I thought it was a defect." She looked at it. "It's not wrong." "No," Grayson said. "It was designed like that specifically. The narrowing at the rear reduces drag. The roofline is part of the aerodynamic argument the builders were making about how a racing car should move through air." They were right. They were right. They just never got to prove it. Serena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been doing something for the last 6 months or so." She said it the way people said things when they'd been sitting on them and had decided the moment was right. "I've been going through the rest of the family holdings, the warehouses, the estate property inventory, everything that my father kept because he hadn't gotten around to deciding what to do with it, and that I kept because I hadn't either." Grayson looked at her. "Not because I think there's another car like this somewhere," she said quickly. "There isn't. It's not about finding something valuable." She paused. "I've been looking because I realized I'd been the kind of person who owned things without knowing what she owned. And that bothered me. It bothered me more than losing $9 million worth of market value." She said the last sentence with the particular clarity of someone who'd been honest with themselves about something and found the honesty clarifying. "That's a strange thing to discover about yourself." "It's a useful thing to discover," Grayson said. "Yes." She glanced at him. I've also been doing something with the foundation. My father set one up years ago. It existed mostly for tax purposes, which is a terrible reason for a foundation to exist. I've been redirecting it. Education access, vocational training, some community infrastructure work in rural counties. A pause. I've been talking to a woman named Esperanza in your county, actually. She reached out through a community development network about a matching fund for the program you set up. Grayson went still for a moment. He hadn't known that. Esperanza hadn't mentioned it, which was probably deliberate on Esperanza's part. She was a woman who made things happen without narrating the process. She's good at what she does, he said. She's exceptional at what she does, and she's extraordinarily direct about what works and what doesn't, which I find... Serena seemed to search for the word. Refreshing is too mild. Necessary. I find it necessary. Yeah, Grayson said. That's Esperanza. Sophie had been listening to this exchange without contributing, which was what she did when she was processing something. After a moment, she said, "So you're both doing the same kind of thing now?" Something like that, Serena said. Started from the same place. The car. Sophie looked at it. That's interesting. It was interesting, Grayson thought. It was the kind of interesting that you couldn't have scripted, and that would have sounded contrived if you put it in a story, except that it was real, and real things didn't have to earn the right to be what they were. They had lunch together, Grayson, Sophie, Serena, Achterberg, and Dr. Nair, at a place around the corner from the museum that had been Dr. Nair's suggestion, a narrow restaurant with too many tables and food that was better than the room suggested. It was the kind of lunch where the conversation moved between the formal and the informal without losing either, where Sophie asked Achterberg about the other significant finds of his career and got a 40-minute answer she seemed to find entirely worth listening to, where Dr. Nair told a story about a pre-war German racing car authentication that had gone badly wrong in ways that were, in retrospect, genuinely funny, and where Serena ordered the wrong thing and ate most of Grayson's anyway without making it a thing, which told him something about who she was when she wasn't in a professional context. It was imperfect and a little too loud, and the service was slow and nobody was performing anything, and it was one of the better meals Grayson could remember. On the drive back to Harlow, they left Sunday morning, Sophie with her new books and a catalog from the museum gift shop that she'd bought with her own money. Sophie read for the first 3 hours, and then put the book down somewhere in Tennessee and looked out the window at the October landscape going past. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "Do you think you're the same person you were before the car?" He thought about it the way the question deserved, not deflecting, not with a quick answer that was technically true, but not really. He drove for a moment while he thought. "No," he said, "but I don't think the car changed me. I think..." He paused. "I think the situation gave me room to be something I already was, but didn't have the space to be. Does that make sense?" Sophie considered it. "Like the car," she said. "What do you mean?" "The car was always what it was. It was always worth what it was worth. It just needed someone to create the conditions where that could be visible." She looked at him. "You were already someone who paid attention and did things right and thought about other people. You just didn't have the resources to express that at the scale you wanted." He looked at the road. "When did you get this smart?" "I've always been this smart," she said, without vanity, just as a factual statement. "You raised me to say true things plainly." "I did do that." "Yeah." She picked up her book again. "You did." They drove through the rest of Tennessee and into Arkansas as the afternoon light went amber and long, and Sophie read and occasionally read sentences aloud to him when she found something she thought he'd find interesting, which was a habit she'd had since she was 9. And he listened and sometimes responded and sometimes just let the sentence exist in the truck cab as a piece of the afternoon. He thought about Serena, somewhere in the air between Philadelphia and Austin by now, going back to the work she'd described. He thought about Esperanza and the matching fund he hadn't known about, and about the families that money was finding in the county's gaps. He thought about Dario at the garage in Harlow, holding things together competently for the 4 days Grayson was gone, because Dario had grown into the work the same way the work had grown around him. He thought about the car in its alcove in Philadelphia, conserved and real and lit at the right angle, showing its age and its history and the particular beauty of a thing that had been built with complete seriousness and had survived by being finally seen. There was a version of this story, he knew, that someone else might have told differently. A version where the money was the point, where the transformation was the point, where the lesson was delivered cleanly and the ending tied in a bow. He didn't live in that version. He lived in a version where Sophie had too much cumin in her chili and Dario made terrible coffee, and the county road still had a pothole, and the accounting at midnight was easier now but still happened because money made problems different, not absent. Where he still had days when the work was hard and his patience was thin and he said the wrong thing and had to circle back to it later. Where Sophie was 13 and wonderful and also 13, which meant she was learning how to be disagreeable in new ways as fast as she was learning everything else. He didn't live in the clean version. He lived in the real one. He thought about a workshop in Lyon in 1951 and someone bending a piece of metal to match a line they'd drawn on paper. Someone believing in a shape enough to make it real. He thought about the fact that the car had been designed to race and had never raced, had been built to prove something about how a machine could move through air and had never had the chance to prove it and was now in a museum where it would never move at all. And that this was not, somehow, a tragedy. The car had become something other than what it was built for and had found a value in that other thing that its builders hadn't planned for. It had become an argument for looking closely. A demonstration of what patient attention could find in a thing that everyone else had already dismissed. Grayson had not gone to that warehouse looking for anything. He'd gone because Phil Duchamp had a day rate and a lead, and Grayson needed the money. He'd stopped in front of a ruined coupe because something in the shape of it had caught his attention before he'd decided to pay attention, the way real things sometimes announced themselves before you were ready to hear the announcement. He'd learned, or maybe confirmed what he'd always known, but hadn't had occasion to test at this scale, that the most important skill was not cleverness or education or connection or even persistence, though all of those mattered. The most important skill was the willingness to stop, to actually look, to let the looking take as long as it needed, without knowing in advance what it was going to find. Most people walked past things, not because they were stupid or careless, mostly because they were busy and tired and the world contained more things than any person could stop for, and you had to develop filters just to function. He understood that. He'd walked past plenty of things in his life that he'd later wished he'd stopped for. He would walk past things in the future. Nobody looked closely at everything. It wasn't possible. But the practice of it, the habit of slowing down when something pulled at attention, even when you didn't know why yet, even when the surface said there was nothing there. That practice was something you could develop, something you could teach, something that cost nothing except the willingness to be wrong about what you'd find, to look and find nothing and not be embarrassed by the looking. Sophie had it. She'd had it at 12, when she'd put the cartography book face down and walked around a rust-eaten coupe in a garage and said, "It's not American, the way it gets narrower at the back." She'd have it at 30 and 50 and beyond, and she'd apply it to things he couldn't predict, in directions he wouldn't live to see, and some of those things she'd find would matter in ways that couldn't be assessed yet. That was the part that filled him, not with pride exactly. Pride was too self-congratulatory, but with something closer to gratitude. Not the performed kind, the real kind, the kind that sat quietly in the chest and didn't need an occasion to surface. The truck crossed into Arkansas in the early evening, the sky going purple and orange in the west in the way October skies did in this part of the country, extravagant and temporary, and Sophie put the book down and looked at the sky without saying anything, and Grayson drove and the radio played something low that neither of them reached to change. They were home by midnight, later than planned because they'd stopped for dinner outside Little Rock at a diner Sophie had found online that turned out to be exactly what it advertised, which was not always how online recommendations worked. They pulled down the Kalish Road at 11:50, the potholes still there, still exactly the same depth it had been since October of last year, apparently immortal. Sophie laughed when the truck hit it. "Still there," she said. "Still there," he agreed. He parked, and they brought their bags in, and the house smelled like the house always smelled, and Sophie said goodnight and went to her room, and he heard the particular sound of her settling in, the creak of the bed, the low music she played, and then quiet. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. The lockbox was on the shelf where it always was, the authentication documents, and the provenance papers inside. The folder of things he wanted to remember was on the counter. The light over the sink was the same light it had always been. A little too yellow, something he'd been meaning to replace for 2 years. He'd replace it this week, he thought. He had the time now. He could actually do the small things. He turned off the kitchen light and went to the garage and stood in the doorway without switching on the overhead lights. The garage was dark, lit only by what came in from outside. The distant glow of Harlow's street lighting diffused through the west-facing door, enough to see the shapes of things. The Suburban he'd been working on when Sophie asked him about parallel lives. The workbench, Sophie's desk with the lamp off. The tools hung in their places on the wall, the order he'd established and maintained for 15 years because order in the physical environment was something he could control when other things weren't controllable. The corner where the coupe had sat was empty, as it had been since April. But the space it had left wasn't the sad kind of empty. It was the kind of empty that a thing leaves when it's gone to the right place, functional, ready, not haunted. He stood there for a moment, in the dark, in his garage, in Harlow, Texas, and let the quiet be what it was. Then he turned off the light he hadn't turned on and went inside and went to bed. And in the morning there would be work, and the work would be what it had always been. The thing itself, done right, done honestly, for the people who needed it done. That was enough. It had always been enough. He just had room now to know it.